Welcome to 2 Cents Tuesday. Before I go any further, I want to extend my sincere condolences to the family of our 63rd homicide victim, whose life was brutally ended this morning, and to the previous 62 victims who also lost their lives to violent crime this year. I do not know that there is anything more that I can say or even want to say on the state of crime in our country, or on the scary and depressing fact that the social fabric of our country is shredding right before our eyes. If you think I'm exaggerating, have a look at the types of videos that are trending on our social media here in St. Lucia. We need more than supplications to God to put a hand or public service announcements asking people to stop the violence. Maybe if when my good friend, Dr. Stephen King, had done his first PSA many, many years ago about how tired he was of performing postmortems on victims of violent crime and called on us to stop the violence, we had actually embarked on a comprehensive, evidence-based social protection program targeting the vulnerable and at-risk groups in our country, but also extending to the broader population, we would not be in the position we are today. But we do not like long-term solutions. We prefer the quick fix. We do not like to deal with the root of our problems. We prefer to blame our predecessor for causing the problem. We do not like being multi-sectoral and bipartisan in our approaches. We want to take all the glory for ourselves to show that we alone could have made it happen. So we are where we are today. But it is not too late to act. However, honestly, I am yet to see anything coming from official circles that suggests there is an appetite for long-term, comprehensive, all-encompassing approaches to dealing with violent crime. Therefore, last year the number was 74. This year, with almost 7 weeks left before the year ends, it is 63. Fingers crossed, since that appears to be the most effective approach we use these days, it does not climb any higher. But 63 murders in St. Lucia in a year is already 63 murders too many. This week, I want to chat briefly about the climate change conference that just ended in Egypt. Every year, these meetings, which are called Conference of the Parties, or COP, take place in another part of the world. Last year, it was Glasgow, Scotland. This year, it was Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Next year, it will be the United Arab Emirates. This means every year, anywhere between 25,000 and 35,000 people from all over the globe fly into one city to hold one of these COPs. They've been doing this now since 1995. And the only year when there was no COP was 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The big issues at this year's COP, COP27, were whether the meeting would agree to set up a new funding mechanism for loss and damage, and whether there would be a stronger commitment to reduce the global emissions of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane in order to keep the long-term temperature increase goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. When we speak about loss and damage, we refer to these impacts of climate change to which we cannot adapt. Things like extreme weather events such as hurricanes and slow onset impacts like sea level rise and our oceans becoming more acidic because they're being forced to absorb more carbon dioxide. If a country starts to lose its coastline as the sea encroaches further inland, there is nothing that you can do to adapt. You cannot build a massive seawall all around the island. There are low-lying islands like Tuvalu, Kiribati, Fiji, the Marshall Islands, and some of the islands in the Bahamas that will probably no longer exist by the end of this century. The projections for sea level rise in St. Lucia suggest that if things do not change and they remain on their current trajectory, the ocean will encroach as far inland as the shock roundabout by Massi Mega. When a hurricane like Hurricane Maria passes over Dominica and causes destruction equal to 226% of the GDP of that country in the space of 24 hours, you cannot adapt to that. This is why the Small Island Developing States, or SIDS as they are called for a special fund to address this. At COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009, which was my first COP, the developed countries made a commitment to provide $100 billion annually to developing countries to help them fight climate change. We are in 2022, and we have not seen anywhere near that level of funding. To add insult to injury, a large percentage of the funds that have been provided have been made available as loans. So, the same countries that cause the climate change problems for us, the problems that we are dealing with that are causing us so much hardship, and that have promised us money to help us deal with those problems, are telling us that we must borrow that money from them. That is the equivalent of someone meeting me in front of my home, beating me up for absolutely no reason, breaking both my legs, and then the court telling me that I must borrow money from the same person who beat me up to buy the crutches that I will need to use if I want to walk again. There's no justice in that. Even if we were to get the promised $100 billion annually, it would not be enough. The United Nations has estimated that the funding needed for developing countries like ours to adapt to climate change will rise to between 160 and 340 billion every year by 2030, and to between 315 to 365 billion annually by 2050. And that figure is only for the things to which we can adapt, like building sturdier and higher bridges and roads, and strengthening our public health systems. The cost for loss and damage, which, as I explained earlier, are the things to which we cannot adapt, are estimated by Oxfam to reach somewhere between $290 billion and $580 billion US a year by 2030, and it could rise to trillions of US dollars annually by 2050. Small island developing states have been calling for action on loss and damage since 1992. It was not until COP19 in Warsaw, Poland, that there was an agreement to establish something called the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, or the WIM. That was my second COP as a minister. We had to fight hard and long for that. We almost did not get it. It took an intense huddle in the plenary room, which I found myself in the middle of, on the Saturday evening, a full day after the COP was officially scheduled to end, for us to get an agreement on a mechanism to address loss and damage. That is a full 21 years after the countries that have been recognized as being the most vulnerable to climate change, the small island developing states, first raised the issue. And that really is the problem of the COPs. Every time a compromise has to be made, we, the small island developing states and developing countries, are the ones that must make it. We are always the proverbial Wavette d'Uverpool in these negotiations. When we got to Paris for COP21 in 2015, when I was leading the Caribbean's delegation in these negotiations, once again, we faced very stiff opposition from the United States of America, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, Canada, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, among other countries, to get loss and damage included as a separate element in the text of the Paris Agreement. Had it not been for the strategic support of the French presidency and some determined work from the awesome team of Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, negotiators, that every year punch well above their weight in these COPs, we would not have succeeded. But the developed countries remained adamant. There would be nothing in the agreement that spoke of liability and compensation in the section on loss and damage. We were forced to go along with that or lose loss and damage completely. So once again, we compromise. This year at COP27, our negotiators pulled off a miracle of sorts and managed to not only get loss and damage included on the agenda for the meeting, but they were able to get the COP to agree to set up a separate funding mechanism for loss and damage, to compensate those countries that are suffering loss and damage. This is a notable victory, but there's a problem, and I'm sure you can guess where I'm going with this. If the countries that agreed to set up this new fund are the same ones that 13 years ago promised to provide $100 billion annually and have not done so, what are the chances that we will get the level of funding that is needed to operationalize this loss and damage fund, and also that we will see an access system for those funds that will allow us to be able to get them in a timely manner? One of the problems with the current funding mechanisms, like the Green Climate Fund, is that accessing these funds is a very complex and onerous process. But there is another bigger problem with the outcome of this COP. And it relates to the other big issue that I alluded to earlier. The COP could not agree on language that spoke to a phasing out of fossil fuels, which are the cause of the climate change problem. And this is not surprising, given that there were over 600 fossil fuel lobbyists in attendance. That's actually more than the combined delegations of all the small island developing states. Right now, with the pledges and policies from developed countries that are in place, our planet will warm by 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. This will be absolutely catastrophic for countries like ours. Hurricanes will get stronger and more deadly. Glaciers at the North and South Pole will melt. Sea levels will rise and completely cover some countries. Droughts will become very intense and more frequent. Some plant and animal species will become extinct. There will be more forests and bushfires. Temperatures will become hotter and more unbearable. Vector-borne diseases and respiratory illnesses will intensify. Flash flooding, like we've been seeing recently in St. Lucia, will increase. And our oceans will become warmer and more acidic, which will cause coral reefs to die and marine life to disappear in some places. Cultures and communities will also disappear when this happens. It is irreversible, and no amount of funding will help our children and our grandchildren to be able to enjoy the quality of life that we now enjoy and take for granted. The same rich G20 countries that cannot commit to providing climate finance to developing countries like ours are heavily subsidizing their big oil companies. Since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, the G20 countries have provided over $3 trillion in subsidies to fossil fuels. And last year alone, that figure was $200 billion. So they cannot find money to help small islands and other developing countries deal with climate change, but they can continue to subsidize the same fossil fuels that are causing climate change by hundreds of billions of US dollars every year. Therefore, while I applaud my former colleagues for what they achieved in Egypt at COP27, and I continue to marvel at how, despite being grossly outnumbered and out-resourced in almost every category except willpower, stamina, and determination, they still managed to come out of Sharm el-Sheikh with some notable successes. However, I am not optimistic that we have turned a corner in the fight against climate change, or that we are any closer to seeing the types of actions from developed countries that will cause greenhouse gas emissions to reduce by the required 7% every year until 2030 to get the globe to the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that we need. I don't foresee that happening. I also do not foresee any significant increases in the levels of climate financing that will come our way to allow us to make our people, our communities, and our countries more resilient. So, if asked, did COP27 deliver climate justice to the people who are impacted by climate change? My answer is an emphatic no. What it did do is give them enough to keep their hopes alive that salvation is still faintly possible. Thank you for viewing another 2 Cents Tuesday. Have a safe and productive week. Goodbye.